Sometimes the most innocent discovery can change everything forever. When a grandfather's love is tested by unimaginable wealth, true character emerges from the shadows of the past. In the forgotten corners of Clearwater Valley, 9-year-old Lila and her faithful dog Scout stumble upon something that shouldn't exist, a rusting shipping container filled with $90 million in cash. Word spreads like wildfire through their struggling rural town, and suddenly everyone has opinions about the money. Lila's grandfather, Otis, a quiet man carrying decades of regret about his failures as a father, faces an impossible choice that will define both their futures. As greedy neighbors circle like vultures and local authorities mysteriously turn away, Otis must step forward to protect his granddaughter from dangers he can barely comprehend. But when doing the right thing could cost him everything he has left, what price is a grandfather willing to pay for his family's safety? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from today. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Clearwater Valley, painting the rolling hills in shades of amber and gold that would have been breathtaking if anyone still had time to notice such things. Most folks were too busy trying to make ends meet in a place that seemed forgotten by both prosperity and hope. The valley had once thrived on ranching and small-scale mining, but those days had faded like old photographs, leaving behind a community of stubborn souls who refused to abandon the only home they'd ever known. Otis Matthews stood at his kitchen window, watching his granddaughter Lila chase her German Shepherd mix, Scout, around the yard. At 67, Otis had learned to find joy in simple moments like these, though the weight of his past mistakes never fully lifted from his shoulders. His weathered hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, one of the few remnants from his late wife Sarah's collection, and he allowed himself a rare smile as Lila's laughter echoed across the morning air. The girl was everything bright and good that remained in his world. 9 years old, with braided hair that caught the sunlight, and eyes that still held the wonder that life hadn't yet beaten out of most adults in Clearwater Valley. She moved with the fearless energy of childhood, completely trusting in a world that Otis knew could be cruel and unforgiving. Sometimes he wondered if he was doing her a disservice by keeping her here, away from opportunities that a bigger city might offer. But then he'd remember that he was all she had left, and she was all he had left. And somehow, that simple truth made the decision easier. Scout bounded after Lila with the dedicated enthusiasm that only dogs seemed capable of maintaining throughout their lives. The animal had appeared on their doorstep 3 years ago, a half-starved puppy that Lila had immediately claimed as her own. Otis had initially resisted, another mouth to feed when money was already tight, but Sarah would have welcomed the dog without question. And he found himself unable to disappoint the granddaughter who had already lost so much. "Grandpa!" Lila called from the yard, her voice carrying that particular pitch that meant she'd discovered something worth sharing. Scout found something weird behind the old Henderson place. Otis felt his chest tighten slightly. The Henderson place had been abandoned for 2 years now, ever since the family had finally given up on making their ranch profitable and moved to Denver. Like so many others, they'd left behind empty buildings and unfulfilled dreams. The property had become a magnet for teenagers looking for somewhere to drink beer and make poor decisions. Though Otis had hoped it was far enough from town to keep Lila away from such influences, what kind of something? He called back, setting down his coffee and moving toward the door. "I don't know. It's really big and rusty. Can we go look at it properly?" Before he could respond, the sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Sheriff Bradley's patrol car pulled into the driveway, moving with the deliberate pace that characterized everything about the man. Tom Bradley had been law enforcement in Clearwater Valley for nearly 20 years, and in that time he'd developed a philosophical approach to his job that some called wise and others called lazy. He emerged from the car with the careful movements of a man whose back reminded him daily that he was past 50. "Morning, Otis," Bradley said, touching the brim of his hat in Lila's direction. "Miss Lila, that dog of yours been staying out of trouble?" Scout, as if understanding the question, trotted over and sat perfectly at Lila's feet, tongue lolling out in what looked suspiciously like a grin. The sheriff chuckled and shook his head. "Just coffee," Otis said, recognizing the social ritual. "In a place like Clearwater Valley, you didn't just drop by without a reason, but you also didn't jump straight into business. Sarah's old pot still makes the best cup in the county." They settled on the front porch, Lila and Scout wandering back to their game but staying within earshot. Bradley accepted the offered mug with genuine appreciation. His wife had never mastered the art of coffee, and the station's perpetually burned pot was a running joke among what little law enforcement the county could afford. "Heard from the Chens this morning," Bradley said, after a respectful sip. "Mrs. Chen thinks she's been seeing strangers around town. Cars she doesn't recognize. People asking questions at Jake's store." Otis nodded thoughtfully. Mrs. Chen lived alone in the house closest to the main road and had appointed herself the unofficial sentinel of Clearwater Valley. She had an uncanny ability to spot anything unusual, though her reports ranged from legitimately concerning to hilariously paranoid. Last month she'd been convinced that the new FedEx driver was casing homes for a burglary ring, only to discover he was actually her great-nephew from Portland, whom she'd never met. What kind of questions? Nothing specific, according to Jake. Just people asking about the area, how long families have lived here, whether anyone's come into sudden money recently. Bradley's tone remained casual, but Otis caught the subtle shift that indicated this wasn't just neighborhood gossip. "Probably nothing, but figured you should know. You've got Lila to think about." The reminder was unnecessary, but appreciated. Otis had been thinking about Lila's safety every day since his son Marcus had died in that car accident 3 years ago. The boy had been driving too fast on a rain-slicked road, trying to get back to Portland after one of his increasingly rare visits. Otis still woke up some nights wondering if things might have been different if he'd tried harder to convince Marcus to stay the night, if he'd been a better father, if he'd found the right words to bridge the growing distance between them. Marcus had left Clearwater Valley the day after his high school graduation, determined to find something bigger and better than the small-town life his father had chosen. He'd found work in the city, fallen in with crowds that Otis never quite understood, and visited less and less frequently as the years passed. When he died, he'd left behind debts that Otis couldn't comprehend and a daughter who barely remembered him. The only blessing in the whole tragic mess was that Lila had come to live with her grandparents, bringing light back into a house that had grown too quiet. "I appreciate the heads up," Otis said, his fingers unconsciously moving to touch the dog tags that hung beneath his workshirt. The metal had grown warm against his skin over the decades, a constant reminder of the discipline and vigilance that military service had drilled into him. Most people in town knew he'd served, but few knew the details. 2 tours in Vietnam, then another decade in various capacities that he didn't discuss. He'd learned skills there that he'd hoped never to use again. But lately he'd been remembering training that he thought he'd forgotten, probably just folks passing through, Bradley continued, though his eyes suggested he didn't entirely believe it. But in a place like this, strangers asking questions about money tend to make people nervous. Everyone's struggling enough without outsiders stirring up trouble. That was the truth of Clearwater Valley in a nutshell. The community had been hemorrhaging population for years as young people left for opportunities elsewhere and businesses closed for lack of customers. The lucky families were the ones managing to hang on to their properties. Others had been forced to sell to developers or simply walk away from underwater mortgages. The result was a patchwork of occupied homes, empty lots, and abandoned buildings that served as monuments to better times. Jake Morrison's general store remained the unofficial heart of the community, one of the few businesses still operating at something approaching profitability. Jake had inherited the store from his father and had managed to adapt to changing times by expanding into basic, automotive repairs, and serving as an unofficial post office for residents who lived too far from town for reliable mail delivery. His establishment served as both supply depot and information exchange, the place where news traveled fastest and rumors took root. Mrs. Chen, for all her occasional flights of paranoid fancy, represented another pillar of the community's informal structure. At 73, she had outlived 2 husbands and raised 4 children who now lived scattered across the country. She'd stayed in Clearwater Valley not from lack of options, but from genuine love for the place and its people. Her small house near the main road gave her an excellent view of comings and goings, and she'd long ago appointed herself the unofficial neighborhood watch coordinator. These were the people who made up Lila's world, and Otis recognized both the blessing and the limitation that represented. She was growing up surrounded by adults who cared about her welfare and would step in to help if needed. But she was also growing up in a place where opportunities were limited and the future often looked uncertain. He wanted better for her, but wasn't sure how to provide it without leaving behind everything that had shaped his understanding of what mattered in life. "Grandpa," Lila called from the yard, interrupting his thoughts. "Can we go exploring now? Scout really wants to show you what he found." Otis looked at Bradley, who shrugged and stood up. "Mind if I tag along?" Mrs. Chen specifically mentioned seeing people around the Henderson place, and it wouldn't hurt to take a look. They walked together across the field that separated Otis's property from the abandoned ranch, Lila skipping ahead with Scout ranging back and forth in front of her like a 4-legged escort. The morning had grown warmer, and grasshoppers scattered before their navit as they made their way through grass that had grown wild. Without regular maintenance, the place looked even more forlorn in daylight than it did from a distance. The main house stood empty, with windows that stared blindly across the valley, while outbuildings sagged under the weight of neglect. Weeds had taken over what had once been Martha Henderson's vegetable garden, and the corral fencing had begun to lean at angles that suggested it wouldn't survive another harsh winter. "Over here," Lila called from behind the house, where an old SUV sat on blocks. The vehicle had been there since before the Hendersons left, a casualty of repair costs that exceeded the family's budget. Scout was circling something beyond the vehicle, his tail wagging with the enthusiasm of a treasure hunter who'd struck gold. Otis and Bradley rounded the SUV and stopped short. Behind it, partially concealed by overgrown brush, sat a shipping container that definitely hadn't been there the last time Otis had checked on the property. The metal box was perhaps 20 feet long and 8 feet high. Its once bright paint faded to a rust-streaked orange that spoke of years exposed to weather. What caught Otis's immediate attention, however, was the heavy padlock that secured the container's doors, a lock that hung open, its metal clasp broken as if someone had recently forced it. Bradley whistled low under his breath. "Well, that's definitely not supposed to be here." Lila had approached the container with the fearless curiosity of childhood, but Scout was behaving differently now. The dog had stopped wagging his tail and was standing perfectly still, his ears forward and his attention focused on the container, with an intensity that made Otis's old instincts stir to life. "Lila." "Honey, step back a bit," Otis said quietly, his voice carrying just enough authority to stop the girl in her tracks. "Let Sheriff Bradley and I take a look first." The broken padlock told a story that Otis didn't like. Someone had been here recently, someone with tools and purpose. As he approached the container, he could see that the doors weren't fully closed. There was a gap of perhaps an inch that suggested either hasty departure or deliberate invitation. Bradley drew his service weapon, not pointing it at anything in particular, but keeping it ready as he positioned himself to one side of the doors. Otis found himself automatically taking position on the other side, muscle memory from decades past guiding his movements. "Police," Bradley called out, though his voice lacked the conviction of someone expecting a response. "If anyone's in there, make yourself known." Silence answered them, broken only by the sound of wind through the tall grass and Scout's quiet whining. The dog had remained obediently with Lila, but everything about his posture suggested he was aware of something the humans had yet to understand. Bradley reached out and pulled one of the container doors open, the metal hinges protesting with a squeal that seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. Sunlight streamed into the container's interior, illuminating something that made both men freeze in place. The container wasn't empty. It was filled, from floor to ceiling, with neat stacks of bundled currency. More money than either man had ever seen in one place, arranged with the kind of precision that suggested criminal organization rather than legitimate business. "Sweet Jesus," Bradley whispered, his weapon forgotten as he stared at what had to be millions of dollars in cash. Otis felt his heart rate spike as his mind immediately began calculating implications and possibilities. This kind of money didn't just get left behind accidentally. Someone was coming back for it, or someone was already looking for it, or someone was going to be very unhappy when they discovered it was gone. "Grandpa." Lila's voice carried a note of concern.
"Is everything okay?"
Otis turned to look at his granddaughter, standing 50 feet away with her faithful dog, both of them representing everything innocent and good in his world. The money in the container represented something else entirely, opportunity and danger in equal measure. The kind of discovery that could change everything or destroy everything, depending on the choices made in the next few minutes. His fingers found his dog tags again, the metal warm and familiar beneath his shirt. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of an approaching vehicle, though he couldn't yet see it through the morning haze. Time was running out for careful consideration, and decisions would have to be made quickly. But first, he needed to get Lila somewhere safe while he figured out exactly what they'd stumbled into. The sound of the approaching vehicle grew louder, and Bradley quickly stepped in front of the container opening, blocking the view of the money from anyone who might be coming up the road. Otis instinctively moved toward Lila, his protective instincts overriding everything else. "Honey, I need you and Scout to head back to the house right now," he said, keeping his voice calm despite the urgency he felt. "Start on your schoolwork, and don't mention what we found here to anyone else just yet. Can you do that for Grandpa?" Lila's eyes darted between the two men, picking up on the tension that had suddenly filled the air. She was a perceptive child, too perceptive sometimes, and Otis could see her mind working to understand why the adults had become so serious so quickly. "Is it bad?" she asked, her hand dropping to rest on Scout's head. The dog pressed against her leg, sensing her uncertainty. "It's complicated," Otis said, which was perhaps the most honest answer he could give. "But right now, the most important thing is that you're safe. So please go home, and we'll talk about this later." The approaching vehicle turned out to be Jake Morrison's pickup truck, loaded with supplies for his store. He waved as he passed, heading toward town without stopping. But his presence served as a reminder that they were visible from the road and needed to be careful about drawing attention. Bradley closed the container door as soon as Jake's truck disappeared around the bend. "We need to secure this area and figure out what we're dealing with," he said, his law enforcement training kicking in. "This could be evidence in an ongoing investigation, or it could be the proceeds from something we haven't heard about yet." Otis nodded, but his mind was racing in different directions. "How much do you think is in there?" "Hard to say without counting, but if those bundles are hundreds and they're packed that tight..." Bradley shook his head. "Could be 50 million, could be more. Hell, could be 90 million or beyond. This isn't petty cash from a convenience store robbery." They spent the next 20 minutes conducting a more thorough examination of the container while keeping watch for any other visitors. The money was indeed organized with professional precision, bundled in amounts that suggested systematic counting and storage. But more disturbing were the documents they found tucked between some of the cash stacks, shipping manifests, phone numbers, and what appeared to be coded references to locations and dates. "This is way above my pay grade," Bradley admitted, photographing some of the documents with his phone. "I need to call this into the state police, maybe the feds, depending on what they think we're looking at." That's when Otis felt the first real stab of conflict. The legal thing to do was obvious. report the find, turn everything over to the appropriate authorities, and let them sort out where the money came from and where it should go. But the practical implications were more complex. If this money disappeared into the machinery of law enforcement, Lila would get nothing from it. Her future would remain as uncertain as it had been that morning, dependent on his modest pension and whatever he could scrape together through odd jobs. "What if we don't report it right away?" he heard himself saying, the words coming out before his better judgment could stop them. Bradley looked at him sharply. "Otis, you know better than that. This isn't found treasure we're talking about. This money came from somewhere illegal, and whoever put it here is going to want it back. Getting between criminals and their cash is a good way to get yourself killed. But what if they don't come back for it? What if it's been sitting here for months or years? Then it's still evidence of a crime, and it still needs to go through proper channels." Bradley's voice carried the patience of a man who'd had similar conversations with citizens before. "I know things are tight for you and Lila, but this isn't the answer. This is the kind of money that has bodies attached to it." Otis knew Bradley was right, but the knowledge didn't make the decision easier. He thought about Lila's future, about the scholarship applications he'd been helping her fill out for private schools that might give her opportunities Clearwater Valley couldn't provide. He thought about the medical bills from Sarah's final illness, debts that still hung over him like a shadow. He thought about his son Marcus, who'd left home chasing dreams of easy money and had died broke and alone. They secured the container as best they could and agreed to meet later that evening to discuss next steps. Bradley would spend the day researching similar cases and determining which agencies needed to be notified. Otis would keep Lila close to home and try to figure out how to explain the situation to her without scaring her or burdening her with adult decisions. Walking back across the field, Otis noticed that Lila had been busy during their absence. She'd left a piece of paper on the kitchen table, a hand-drawn map showing the route from their house to the Henderson place, complete with landmarks and a carefully marked X where Scout had made his discovery. At the bottom of the page, she'd written in her careful cursive, "Scout's treasure map, for Grandpa in case he needs to find it again." The innocent thoughtfulness of the gesture hit him harder than he'd expected. She'd been thinking about helping him, about making sure he could find his way back to something that might be important. She had no idea that her simple drawing might become crucial evidence, or that it represented the kind of detail that could make the difference between safety and danger. That afternoon, while Lila worked on her actual schoolwork at the kitchen table, Otis found himself returning again and again to the window that faced the Henderson place. He couldn't see the container from his house, but knowing it was there changed everything about the familiar landscape. The afternoon seemed longer than usual, shadows moving too slowly across the valley floor as his mind wrestled with possibilities and consequences. The money was real. That much had been confirmed beyond doubt, but everything else remained question marks. Who had put it there? Why had they abandoned it? Were they planning to return for it? Or had something happened that made retrieval impossible? And most importantly, what would happen to anyone who got caught in the middle of whatever criminal enterprise had generated that much cash? Round 4 o'clock, Mrs. Chen called with her daily report on neighborhood activities. She'd seen more unfamiliar cars that day, including one that had stopped at the end of Otis's driveway before driving away without getting out. The description she provided, dark sedan with tinted windows, wasn't particularly helpful, but the fact that someone was obviously watching the area sent ice through Otis's veins. Did they seem lost? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. No, honey. They knew exactly where they were. Sat there for maybe 5 minutes, engine running, then drove off toward town. Made me nervous enough that I wrote down the first few letters of the license plate, but couldn't see the whole thing from my window. After hanging up, Otis sat at his kitchen table and stared at Lila's map. The child's drawing suddenly seemed prophetic rather than innocent. Someone else clearly knew about the container, and they were conducting surveillance to determine who might have found it. The broken padlock that had initially seemed like an invitation now felt more like a trap. The moral mathematics of the situation kept shifting in his mind. Keeping the money would be theft, regardless of how it had gotten there. But reporting it might put Lila in danger from people who wouldn't hesitate to hurt a child to protect their interests. Not reporting it might also put her in danger if the wrong people decided the grandfather and granddaughter knew too much. By the time Bradley returned that evening, Otis had made up his mind about one thing. Whatever they decided to do about the money, Lila's safety had to be the primary consideration. Everything else was secondary to protecting the only family he had left. "I've been thinking," Bradley said as they sat on the front porch, speaking in low voices while Lila watched television inside. "About your earlier question, about not reporting this right away." Otis looked at him with surprise. "I thought you said that was a bad idea." "It is a bad idea, but it might be the least bad of several bad options." Bradley pulled out his phone and showed Otis a series of news articles he'd found. "I spent the day researching similar cases. Large amounts of cash found in rural areas, usually connected to drug trafficking or money laundering operations. You know what happens to the people who find it?" Otis studied the headlines, each one more disturbing than the last. "They disappear, or worse. Turns out that reporting found criminal proceeds to the authorities doesn't guarantee protection for the people who found them. Sometimes it just puts a target on their backs and tells the bad guys exactly who to blame for their missing money." The two men sat in silence for several minutes, watching the sun set over Clearwater Valley while considering options that seemed to range from dangerous to catastrophic. In the distance, Scout was patrolling the yard with unusual vigilance, as if the dog sensed that their small corner of the world was no longer as safe as it had been that morning. "So, what do we do?" Otis asked finally. Bradley sighed heavily. "We're careful, we watch. We prepare for trouble, and we figure out who that money belongs to before they figure out that we know about it." The evening breeze carried the scent of sage and wild grass, familiar smells that had once represented peace and stability. Now they seemed tinged with uncertainty, as if even the landscape was holding its breath to see what would happen next. By the third day, Otis realized that keeping secrets in Clearwater Valley was like trying to hold water in a sieve. Despite his and Bradley's efforts to maintain discretion, whispers had begun circulating through the community with the persistence of wildfire. It started innocently. "Enough." Mrs. Chen mentioned to Jake Morrison that she'd seen Sheriff Bradley spending an unusual amount of time at the Henderson place. Jake, in turn, wondered aloud to his customers whether the abandoned property might be attracting squatters or drug activity. Pastor Williams heard rumors that someone had been seen examining the old shipping container behind the derelict SUV, and he mentioned his concerns to the handful of families who still attended Sunday services. Each retelling added new details, some accurate and others manufactured from whole cloth. By Wednesday, the story had evolved from strange activity at the Henderson place to possible buried treasure to government cover-up of illegal dumping. The one constant in every version was that Otis, Matthews and his granddaughter had been involved in the discovery. The first sign that the situation was spiraling beyond their control came when Otis noticed Mrs. Chen positioned at her kitchen window with an old brass telescope that had belonged to her late husband. The nautical instrument looked absurdly out of place in rural Montana, but it provided an excellent view of both his property and the Henderson place. She'd been conducting regular surveillance for 2 days, tracking every visitor and documenting every unusual occurrence with the dedication of a professional intelligence analyst. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," Otis called as he walked Scout past her house on their daily route. "Beautiful day for stargazing." She lowered the telescope and offered him a conspiratorial smile. "Actually, I've been keeping an eye on things for you, dear. Can't be too careful with all these strangers poking around. That dark sedan came back yesterday afternoon, and I got a better look at the license plate this time." Despite his growing anxiety about the situation, Otis felt a wave of affection for the elderly woman. Mrs. Chen had appointed herself guardian of the neighborhood, not from nosiness, but from genuine concern for her neighbor's welfare. Her vigilance was born of love, even if the execution sometimes bordered on the absurd. "I appreciate you looking out for us," he said, meaning it. "But I don't want you putting yourself in any danger on our account." Nonsense. At my age, what are they going to do? Threaten me with death? I've buried 2 husbands and raised 4 children. I've seen everything worth seeing and done everything worth doing. If some criminals think they can intimidate me with dark looks and mysterious cars, they're about to learn something about stubborn old ladies. Her words were brave, but Otis noticed that she'd installed new locks on her doors and had begun keeping her late husband's shotgun within easy reach. The community was preparing for trouble, even if no one was entirely sure what form that trouble might take. The second indication that their secret was no longer secret came at Jake's store that afternoon. Otis had gone in for supplies and found the usual group of retired farmers and ranchers gathered around the coffee pot, their conversation dying abruptly when he entered. "Otis," Jake said with forced casualness, "hear you and Sheriff Bradley have been doing some exploring over at the Henderson place." "Just keeping an eye on the property," Otis replied, selecting items from the shelves with deliberate focus. "Tom asked me to check on things, make sure no one's causing trouble over there." The men exchanged glances that spoke volumes. These were people who'd known each other for decades, who'd helped each other through droughts and divorces, births and deaths. But the possibility of found money had introduced a new dynamic into relationships that had previously been based on mutual trust and support. "Must be something pretty interesting to keep drawing his attention," said Roy Henderson, whose family had owned the property until 2 years ago. "Hope it's not something that affects property values in the area." There was an edge to Roy's voice that hadn't been there before, a suggestion that he might have legal claims to consider if something valuable had been discovered on land that had once belonged to his family. Otis recognized the tone, the same note of calculating interest that had crept into several conversations over the past few days. The third and most unsettling sign came that evening, when a stranger appeared at Otis's front door. The man was perhaps 40 years old, well dressed in a way that seemed carefully designed to project both authority and approachability. He wore a business suit that was expensive enough to command respect, but not so expensive as to seem out of place in rural Montana. His smile was warm and professional, the kind practiced by salesmen and politicians. "Mr. Matthews, my name is Tommy Vance. I represent some interested parties who believe you may have come across something that belongs to them." Otis felt every instinct from his military training surge to full alert. The man's posture, his choice of words, the calculated friendliness of his approach, everything screamed danger, wrapped in a veneer of civilized conversation. "I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage." "Mr. Vance, I don't know what you're referring to." "Of course. May I come in? I think we could have a productive conversation about a situation that could benefit everyone involved." From inside the house, Otis could hear Lila practicing piano, a simple melody that Sarah had taught her years ago. The sound of his granddaughter's innocent activity made the contrast with this moment even sharper. He stepped onto the porch and pulled the door closed behind him, putting himself between Tommy Vance and everything he cared about protecting. "We can talk out here," Otis said. "What exactly are these interested parties interested in?" Tommy's smile never wavered, but his eyes grew colder. "I think you know, Mr. Matthews, a shipping container. Some items that were temporarily stored there for safekeeping. The owners are naturally concerned about their property and would prefer to resolve this situation quietly, without involving unnecessary complications. And if I did know something about a shipping container, what would these owners want from me? Simple cooperation, a willingness to forget about things that don't concern you, and perhaps some assistance in ensuring that local law enforcement doesn't get distracted by matters outside their jurisdiction." The implication was clear. Tommy Vance knew about Sheriff Bradley's involvement. and he was prepared to use that knowledge as leverage. Otis realized that their attempt at discretion had failed completely. Someone had been watching them from the beginning, documenting their activities and preparing to apply pressure at precisely the right moment. "That's an interesting proposition," Otis said carefully. "But I'm not sure I understand why you'd come to me instead of speaking directly with Sheriff Bradley about jurisdictional concerns." Tommy's expression hardened slightly. "Because Sheriff Bradley is a public official with certain obligations that limit his flexibility. You, on the other hand, are a private citizen who can make practical decisions about what's best for his family." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. They knew about Lila. They knew that he would do whatever was necessary to protect her, and they were prepared to use that knowledge to get what they wanted. "I'll need some time to consider what you've said." "Of course. But don't take too long, Mr. Matthews. My employers are patient people, but their patience isn't unlimited, and complications tend to multiply if they're not addressed promptly." Tommy Vance left his business card and departed as smoothly as he'd arrived, driving away in a rental car that was expensive enough to suggest serious backing, but generic enough to avoid drawing attention. Otis watched him go while his mind raced through implications and possibilities. Inside the house, Lila had finished her piano practice and was setting the table for dinner. She looked up when he entered, and he saw something in her expression that made his heart sink. She'd been listening, maybe not to the specific words, but to the tone of the conversation, to the tension in his voice and the stranger's carefully controlled threat. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "is everything okay?" He looked at his granddaughter, 9 years old, and already beginning to understand that the adult world contained dangers that couldn't be explained away with simple reassurances. The discovery of the money had started a chain of events that was changing everything, including her perception of safety in the only home she'd ever known. "Everything's going to be fine, honey," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "But I think we might need to be extra careful for a while, just until some grown-up problems get sorted out." She nodded, with the solemn understanding that children develop when they realize their parents or grandparents are genuinely worried about something. It was a milestone he'd hoped she wouldn't reach for several more years. But Tommy Vance's visit had accelerated the timeline. That night, after Lila had gone to bed, Otis sat on his front porch and tried to figure out how to protect his granddaughter from people who were willing to threaten children to recover stolen money. Sleep came fitfully to Otis that night, interrupted by memories he'd spent 3 years trying to suppress. He found himself reliving the last conversation he'd had with Marcus. The harsh words they'd exchanged about responsibility and choices, about staying versus leaving, about the value of roots versus the lure of opportunity. "This place is dying." "Dad," Marcus had said, gesturing at the valley that stretched beyond their kitchen window. "Can't you see it? Every year fewer kids graduate from the high school. Every year more businesses close. I'm not going to stick around and watch it all crumble just because you're too stubborn to admit that some things can't be saved." Otis had responded with the wounded pride of a man who'd chosen to build his life in Clearwater Valley, who'd believed that hard work and persistence could overcome any obstacle. "Running away from problems doesn't solve them, son. Sometimes the right thing to do is stay and fight for what matters, and sometimes the right thing to do is recognize when you're fighting a losing battle and find somewhere you can actually make a difference." They'd left it there, both of them too proud to back down. Both of them convinced they were right. Marcus had driven away that night, and they'd managed only brief, strained phone conversations in the months that followed. When the state police had called about the accident, Otis's first emotion hadn't been grief. It had been regret for all the words left unsaid, all the bridges left unrepaired, now lying in the darkness with Tommy Vance's threats echoing in his memory. Otis wondered if his son had been right about some things. Maybe Clearwater Valley was dying. Maybe staying and fighting wasn't always the noble choice. Maybe sometimes it was just stubbornness disguised as principle. But Marcus had also been wrong about some things, as Otis had discovered in the painful process of settling his son's affairs. The opportunities that had lured Marcus away from home had turned out to be illusions, get-rich-quick schemes that had left him deeper in debt than he'd been before leaving. The city that had promised excitement and success had ultimately given him nothing but problems he couldn't solve and people he couldn't trust. The next morning, Otis drove to the library in the county seat, a 40-minute journey that gave him time to think about what he was hoping to find. The librarian, a patient woman named Dorothy, who remembered him from his occasional research trips, helped him access newspaper databases and law enforcement bulletins that might shed light on recent criminal activity involving large amounts of cash. What he found was disturbing, but not surprising. Over the past 2 years, there had been a significant increase in money laundering operations throughout the region, connected to drug trafficking routes that ran from Mexico through the southwest and into the Pacific Northwest. The sums involved were staggering, hundreds of millions of dollars that needed to be cleaned and moved through the financial system without attracting federal attention. Rural areas like Clearwater Valley had become favorite locations for temporary storage and processing operations. The isolation provided security from law enforcement surveillance, while the sparse population meant fewer witnesses to unusual activity. Shipping containers had become a common tool for these operations, easily transported and inconspicuous when placed in areas where industrial equipment wouldn't seem out of place. The pattern was always the same. Criminals would establish temporary operations in remote locations, process or store their proceeds for a few months, then move on before local authorities became aware of their activities. Sometimes they left behind traces of their presence, abandoned equipment, discarded paperwork, or in rare cases, money that had been overlooked in hasty departures. Reading between the lines of the official reports, Otis began to understand why Tommy Vance had seemed so confident about recovering the container's contents. These organizations were sophisticated and persistent. They kept detailed records of their operations and had the resources to track down missing assets regardless of how much time and effort were required. The drive home gave him time to consider the implications of what he'd learned. The money in the shipping container wasn't just criminal proceeds. It was evidence of organized criminal activity on a scale that dwarfed anything Clearwater Valley had ever experienced. Getting caught between these people and their money was likely to have consequences that extended far beyond losing the cash itself. That afternoon, he sought out Pastor Williams at the small church that served the valley's remaining faithful. Robert Williams was perhaps 60 years old, a thoughtful man who'd come to Clearwater Valley after retiring from a larger congregation in Billings. He'd been drawn by the same qualities that had kept Otis rooted there: the sense of community, the connection to the land, the belief that small places could nurture important values that were getting lost in larger cities. They sat in the empty sanctuary, sunlight streaming through simple stained glass windows that cast colored patterns on worn wooden pews. Otis had attended services here sporadically since Sarah's death, finding comfort in the familiar rituals even when his faith felt strained by recent losses. "I've been thinking about moral complexity," Otis said, choosing his words carefully. "About situations where doing the legal thing might not be the same as doing the right thing." Pastor Williams nodded thoughtfully. "It's one of the oldest questions in theology. When human law conflicts with divine law, or when following the rules would cause more harm than breaking them. For instance, if someone found something valuable that didn't belong to them, but returning it might put innocent people in danger. That's a variation of what philosophers call the doctrine of double effect. The idea that sometimes we have to choose between competing goods or accept smaller harms to prevent larger ones." The pastor studied Otis's face with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades listening to people wrestle with difficult decisions. "Are we speaking hypothetically, Otis?" "Mostly hypothetically, but I have been thinking about Lila's future lately. about opportunities she might have if circumstances were different. Children have a way of thriving regardless of their circumstances, as long as they're surrounded by love and given moral guidance. Lila is fortunate to have you as her anchor in difficult times. Otis reached into his jacket and touched the worn Bible he'd been carrying since Sarah's death. The leather cover was soft with age, and the pages were marked with pressed flowers from their garden, fragments of sermons that had particularly moved her, and handwritten notes about forgiveness and second chances. He'd found himself reading it more frequently since the discovery of the money, searching for guidance that seemed frustratingly elusive. What if someone had failed before? He asked. Failed as a parent, made mistakes that cost them their relationship with their child. Would that person be justified in taking risks to provide for their grandchild that they wouldn't have taken for themselves? Pastor Williams was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the simple wooden cross that hung above the altar. Redemption is possible, Otis, but it usually comes through doing better in the present, not through trying to compensate for past mistakes with grand gestures. The best thing any of us can do for the children in our care is to model the kind of behavior we want them to emulate. That evening, Lila came to him with shadows under her eyes and a reluctance to go to her room alone. Grandpa, I had a bad dream last night. I dreamed that men came and took you away, and I couldn't find you. He pulled her close, feeling the weight of every decision he'd made or avoided making since the discovery of the shipping container. Children were perceptive in ways that adults often underestimated. She was picking up on his anxiety, his preoccupation with dangers she couldn't understand, but could sense nonetheless. Nobody's going to take me away, honey. I promise you that. But what if they try? It was a fair question, and one that he didn't have a good answer for. Tommy Vance had made it clear that cooperation was expected, not requested. Other people were watching their family, making plans that included Lila, whether Otis consented or not. Then I'll make sure they can't, he said finally. Whatever it takes, I'll make sure you're safe. After tucking her into bed, Otis sat at his kitchen table and began making lists, people he could trust, resources he could call upon, preparations he should make for various scenarios. The military training he'd hoped never to use again whispered suggestions about defensive positions, escape routes and contingency planning. Outside, Scout was patrolling the yard with unusual vigilance, occasionally stopping to stare at shadows that might or might not conceal watching eyes. Mrs. Chen's telescope was visible in her kitchen window, tracking movements that the rest of the neighborhood couldn't see. Clearwater Valley was preparing for something, even though most of its residents weren't sure what they were preparing for. The discovery of $90 million had set in motion events that would test every relationship, every principle, every assumption about safety and trust that the community had taken for granted. Otis opened Sarah's Bible and found the passage she'd marked about protecting the innocent and fighting for justice. Her handwritten notes in the margin reminded him that sometimes the hardest choices were also the most necessary ones, and that love often required sacrifice rather than compromise. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to cooperate with Tommy Vance's demands or find another way to protect his granddaughter from consequences she'd done nothing to deserve. Tonight, he would prepare for the possibility that cooperation might not be enough to keep them safe. The change began subtly, like the first whisper of wind that precedes a storm. On Thursday morning, Otis noticed that Scout's behavior had shifted from vigilant to aggressive. The dog refused to leave Lila's side during their usual morning walk, and twice he'd growled at empty spaces in the tree line where nothing visible moved. "What's wrong with him?" Lila asked, concerned by her companion's unusual tension. Before Otis could answer, Scout suddenly bolted toward the fence line, barking with an intensity that made both of them jump. Through the morning mist, Otis caught a glimpse of someone moving quickly away from their property, someone who'd been close enough to observe their morning routine, but who clearly didn't want to be seen. That afternoon, Jake Morrison called with information that made Otis's blood run cold. "Thought you should know," Jake said, his voice careful and low. "That fellow who was asking questions about you came back to the store today. Bought a lot of supplies, batteries, binoculars, camping gear, paid cash, and seemed real interested in which roads lead back to your part of the valley. Did he say anything specific?" "Nothing threatening exactly. But he asked about your granddaughter. Asked whether she goes to school in town, what her schedule might be like. Made my skin crawl, if you want the truth." Otis felt every protective instinct surge to full alert. Tommy Vance was escalating his pressure tactics, and Lila had become part of the equation in ways that crossed lines no decent person would cross. "Jake, I need you to do me a favor. If that man comes back, or if anyone else starts asking questions about my family, I want you to call Sheriff Bradley immediately. Don't engage with them, don't give them information, just call for backup, already planned on it. This isn't the kind of trouble we need around here." That evening brought more disturbing news. Mrs. Chen's house had been dark for 2 days, and her newspaper was piling up on her front porch. Otis walked over to check on her, but got no response to his knocking. Her car was gone, and neighbors reported seeing an unfamiliar sedan in her driveway on Tuesday night. Sheriff Bradley arrived within an hour of Otis's call, but his demeanor was different, nervous, distracted, constantly checking his phone. They searched Mrs. Chen's property together and found signs of hasty departure, clothes scattered in her bedroom, her prized telescope missing from the kitchen window, and her husband's shotgun gone from its usual spot by the back door. "Could be she went to visit family," Bradley said. But his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Could be she got scared and decided to leave town for a while, or someone decided she was asking too many questions and seeing too many things." Bradley's phone buzzed, and Otis watched the sheriff's face grow pale as he read the message. "I need to head back to the station. There's been some pressure from higher up about jurisdictional issues, and I need to sort through some paperwork." The evasive language told Otis everything he needed to know. Someone with authority had contacted Bradley's superiors, applying pressure to keep local law enforcement from investigating matters that were supposedly outside their purview. The corruption was spreading upward through the system, ensuring that help wouldn't be coming from official channels. Friday morning brought the discovery that changed everything. Scout was acting strangely again, pawing at his collar and whining in a way that suggested genuine distress. When Otis examined the leather collar more closely, he found a small electronic device tucked beneath the metal nameplate, a GPS tracker that hadn't been there the previous week. The implications hit him like a physical blow. Someone had gotten close enough to his granddaughter's dog to plant surveillance equipment. They'd been monitoring his family's movements probably for days, gathering intelligence about routines and vulnerabilities. The invasion of privacy was bad enough, but the message was worse. "We can get to your granddaughter any time we want." He removed the device carefully and set it aside, his mind racing through the tactical implications. If they'd been tracking Scout, they probably had other surveillance measures in place. His property was likely being monitored continuously, and any move he made would be observed and analyzed. The confirmation came that afternoon, when he conducted a systematic search of the areas around his house and found 3 more electronic devices, a motion sensor disguised as a piece of bark near his front door, a listening device attached to the underside of his porch, and a small camera hidden in the old oak tree that provided a clear view of his kitchen window. The professionalism of the surveillance operation told him that he was dealing with people who had resources and experience far beyond typical criminal enterprises. This wasn't amateur intimidation. This was sophisticated intelligence gathering by people who treated privacy. Invasion as a routine business practice. Saturday brought the final confirmation that the situation had moved beyond threats into active operations. Otis drove to the Henderson place to check on the shipping container and found nothing but tire tracks and an empty space where the metal box had been sitting for weeks. The container and its contents had vanished overnight, moved by people with the equipment and manpower to relocate $90 million without leaving witnesses. Sheriff Bradley was waiting at Otis's house when he returned, sitting in his patrol car with the engine running and his face grim. "We need to talk," he said, "but not here. Follow me to the old ranger station up on Bear Creek Road." The abandoned fire station provided privacy for a conversation that Bradley clearly didn't want monitored by official channels. They sat in his car while he explained the pressure that had been applied to shut down any investigation into unusual activities in Clearwater Valley. State police got a call from federal authorities claiming jurisdiction over potential terrorism-related activities in this area, Bradley said. "I'm being told to cease and desist from any activities that might interfere with an ongoing federal operation." Terrorism? It's bullshit, Otis. There's no federal operation here, at least not a legitimate one. Someone with connections is using bureaucratic channels to create cover for criminal activity. They're buying time and creating confusion while they clean up whatever mess they left behind. Bradley pulled out a burner phone and handed it to Otis. "This is between us. If things go sideways, use this to call the number I've programmed in. It goes directly to a state police detective who specializes in organized crime. He's someone I trust, someone who won't be influenced by pressure from above. What about official protection? Witness protection, relocation assistance? That takes time, paperwork, approval from multiple agencies. Time we might not have." Bradley's expression was haunted by the knowledge that his oath to protect and serve was being undermined by forces beyond his control. These people have already demonstrated that they can neutralize local law enforcement when it suits their purposes. If they decide you're too much trouble to manage, official channels won't help you fast enough. They drove back to town in separate vehicles. But Otis noticed that Bradley took a circuitous route that allowed him to check for surveillance. The sheriff was clearly concerned that his own movements were being monitored, which meant the corruption extended even further than either of them had initially realized. That night, Otis began implementing security measures that he'd hoped never to use again. He moved Lila's bedroom to the interior of the house, away from windows that could be observed from outside. He established emergency procedures, signals, meeting places, escape routes, and made sure she understood them without frightening her more than necessary. "Are we playing a game, Grandpa?" she asked, as they practiced moving quietly from her room to the basement. "Sort of," he said, hating the lie, but knowing it was kinder than the truth. "Just something to keep us sharp, in case we ever need to be extra careful about anything." Scout had adapted quickly to the removal of the tracking device, but remained hypervigilant in ways that suggested he understood the threat level had increased. The dog positioned himself between Lila and any potential danger, and refused to let her out of his sight even for routine activities like using the bathroom. As he tucked Lila into her new bedroom that night, Otis realized that they'd crossed a threshold from which there was no easy return. The discovery of the money had set in motion events that were now operating according to their own logic, driven by forces that cared nothing for the innocence of children or the rights of law-abiding citizens. Tommy Vance had been testing their defenses, gathering intelligence and applying pressure designed to force cooperation. But the escalation of surveillance and the removal of the shipping container suggested that the testing phase was coming to an end. Soon, they would have to choose between surrender and resistance, with Lila's safety hanging in the balance of a decision that no grandfather should ever have to make. Sunday morning brought an unusual number of unfamiliar vehicles to Clearwater Valley. Otis counted at least 6 different cars and trucks that had no business being in the area, all driven by people who were clearly conducting surveillance rather than sightseeing. They maintained professional distances and avoided direct contact, but their presence created an atmosphere of impending confrontation that even Lila couldn't ignore. "Grandpa, why are there so many strangers around?" she asked as they watched another sedan drive slowly past their house. "I'm not sure, honey, but I think it would be a good idea for you to spend a few days with Pastor Williams and his wife. They've been asking about having you visit, and this might be a good time." Lila studied his face with the perception of a child who'd learned to read adult anxieties. "Are you coming with me? I need to stay here and take care of some things. But Scout will go with you, and I'll come see you every day." The reluctance in her eyes nearly broke his resolve. She was 9 years old and had already lost too many people she loved. The idea of being separated from him, even temporarily, triggered fears that no amount of reassurance could fully address. "What if something happens to you while I'm gone?" Otis knelt down and took her hands in his, drawing on reserves of calm that he didn't actually feel. "Nothing's going to happen to me, but there are some grown-up problems that need to be sorted out, and I want to make sure you're somewhere safe while I take care of them." That afternoon, he drove Lila and Scout to the small house behind the church where Pastor Williams lived with his wife Margaret. The couple had raised 3 children of their own and welcomed Lila with the kind of warm efficiency that suggested they understood the seriousness of the situation without needing detailed explanations. "She'll be perfectly safe here," Margaret assured Otis as they watched Lila and Scout explore the pastor's study. "Robert keeps his hunting rifles locked in the bedroom closet, and I still remember how to use the shotgun my daddy taught me with when I was younger than..." Lila, the drive home gave Otis time to implement security measures that he'd been planning since the discovery of the surveillance equipment. His military training, dormant for so many years, reasserted itself with uncomfortable familiarity. He found himself thinking in terms of defensive positions, fields of fire, and tactical advantages, concepts that had no place in the peaceful valley that had been his refuge from such considerations. The house felt different without Lila's presence. Quieter, but also more focused. He was no longer balancing the need for preparation against the desire to maintain her sense of normalcy. Now he could concentrate entirely on the problem of staying alive long enough to ensure her safety. His first call was to a number he'd memorized, but hadn't used in 15 years. When Ray Castellanos answered on the second ring, his voice carried the same gravelly authority that had made him an effective sergeant major during their tours together in Southeast Asia. "Matthews. Been wondering when you'd surface again. Heard through the grapevine that you might be having some trouble. Word travels fast in certain circles. Faster when it involves the kind of people who've been asking questions about you. These aren't small-time operators, Otis. We're talking about an organization with connections that reach pretty high up the food chain." Ray had stayed in the military after Otis mustered out, eventually reaching the intelligence community where he'd specialized in tracking money flows connected to international criminal enterprises. His contacts and resources extended far beyond anything that local law enforcement could provide. How high up? High enough to make phone calls that shut down federal investigations. High enough to access law enforcement databases and track movements through official channels. High enough to buy cooperation from people who should know better. The information confirmed Otis's worst fears. They weren't dealing with a regional drug operation that had temporarily stored money in an abandoned shipping container. They were dealing with a sophisticated organization that treated law enforcement corruption as a routine business expense. What's my tactical situation look like? Not good. They've been planning this for at least a week, maybe longer. Multiple teams converging on your location with backup support that includes surveillance technology and communication intercept capabilities. They know where you are, who you're in contact with, and what resources you have available. Ray paused, and Otis could hear keyboard typing in the background. But here's what they don't know. You've got friends they haven't identified, and you've got skills they probably don't expect from a 67-year-old grandfather. If you're smart about this, you might have options they haven't planned for. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Ray providing intelligence updates and tactical advice that painted a picture of overwhelming odds balanced against superior knowledge of local terrain and conditions. The criminal organization had numbers and resources, but they were operating in unfamiliar territory against someone who'd spent decades learning every hill, creek, and deer path in Clearwater Valley. By evening, Otis had established defensive positions at 3 different locations, cached supplies at 2 more, and created communication links that bypassed normal channels. His house had become the obvious target, but it was also the most defensible position if things deteriorated into open confrontation. The call from Sheriff Bradley came just after sunset. "I've been ordered to stay away from your property," Bradley said, frustration evident in his voice. "Effective immediately. Any law enforcement response to incidents in your area has to go through state police dispatch, and they're being told that federal authorities will handle any situations that develop. They're isolating me completely. If something happens to you tonight, official help won't arrive until it's too late to matter." "I'm sorry, Otis. I've never felt more useless in my life." Bradley's call was followed by another from Ray, this one carrying urgent information that changed the tactical landscape entirely. The money in that shipping container wasn't just proceeds from drug trafficking. It was operational funds for a major expansion into your region. We're talking about plans to establish permanent distribution networks throughout the mountain states, with projected revenues in the hundreds of millions. That explains why they're willing to take risks to get it back. It explains why they're willing to eliminate witnesses to get it back. This isn't about punishing theft. This is about protecting an investment that's worth more than the actual money involved. The final piece of intelligence was the most disturbing. The organization had tentacles reaching into state and federal agencies that went beyond simple corruption. They'd systematically infiltrated law enforcement networks to create protection for their operations and early warning systems for potential threats. "Otis, you need to understand something. These people don't just kill witnesses. They eliminate entire families to send messages about the consequences of interfering with their business. If they've identified you as a threat, they won't stop with just you." Darkness fell over Clearwater Valley with unusual weight, as if the familiar landscape was holding its breath in anticipation of violence. Otis checked his defensive preparations one final time, then settled in to wait for whatever the night might bring. At 11:45, he found a burner phone on his front porch. Someone had approached his house, left the device, and departed without triggering any of the perimeter alarms he'd established. The phone contained a single message: "They're coming tonight. Take the girl and run." The anonymous warning forced a decision he'd been avoiding. He could collect Lila and attempt to escape, relying on mobility and the hope that they could stay ahead of pursuit long enough to reach safety. Or he could trust that Pastor Williams's house provided adequate protection and make his stand alone, using his military training and knowledge of local terrain to even odds that were stacked heavily against him. Either choice carried risks that could cost Lila everything. But the time for avoiding decisions had passed. The storm was about to break over Clearwater Valley, and a 67-year-old grandfather would have to remember how to be a soldier if he wanted to protect the only family he had left. He picked up the burner phone and dialed the number Ray had given him for emergency assistance. If he was going to fight, he wouldn't do it completely alone. And if he was going to die, he'd make sure that Lila had protectors who couldn't be bought or intimidated by criminal organizations with money and connections. The night was about to teach everyone involved the difference between threatening an old man and threatening his granddaughter. The sound of Tommy Vance's rental car pulling into the driveway came at exactly midnight, as if he'd timed his arrival to maximize the psychological impact. Otis watched from his bedroom window as the man stepped out of the vehicle, with the unhurried confidence of someone who held all the advantages in whatever negotiation was about to take place. But this time, Tommy wasn't alone. A second man emerged from the passenger seat, older, heavier, with the kind of stillness that suggested he was accustomed to violence. 2 more vehicles followed, parking strategically to block potential escape routes. At least 6 men total, all moving with professional coordination that confirmed Ray's intelligence about the scope of the operation. Otis had prepared for this moment. But seeing it unfold still sent adrenaline coursing through his system in ways that brought back unwelcome memories of night operations in hostile territory. He activated the recording device he'd positioned near the front door, gathered the evidence he'd accumulated over the past week, and prepared to face whatever Tommy Vance had come to demand. The knock on the front door was polite, almost courteous. "Mr. Matthews, it's Tommy Vance. I think it's time we had that conversation." Otis opened the door, but remained in the threshold, making it clear that the visitors weren't welcome inside his home. "Kind of late for social calls, isn't it?" "Time is a luxury we no longer have," Tommy replied, his previous veneer of friendliness replaced by business-like efficiency. "My employers have run out of patience with this situation, and they've authorized me to resolve it tonight, one way or another. And what does resolution look like from their perspective? That depends on your level of cooperation. May I suggest we sit on your porch? I have some things to show you that might change your understanding of recent events." Against his better judgment, Otis stepped outside and took a seat in one of the wooden chairs that Sarah had placed there for quiet evening conversations. Tommy sat across from him while his associates took positions that provided security without being overtly threatening. "Before we discuss terms," Tommy said, "I think you deserve to understand exactly what you've stumbled into. This isn't just about found money, Mr. Matthews. This is about family." Tommy reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila envelope, extracting several photographs that he placed carefully on the small table between them. The first image made Otis's heart stop. It showed Tommy Vance standing next to Marcus, both men smiling at some social gathering that appeared to have taken place in an upscale restaurant or bar. "You recognize your son, of course," Tommy said quietly. "This was taken about 6 months before his death. He was working for our organization at the time, handling logistics for some of our more sensitive operations." Otis stared at the photograph, his mind reeling from implications that he hadn't considered. Marcus had been involved with these people? His son, who'd left Clearwater Valley seeking legitimate opportunities, had ended up working for the kind of criminal enterprise that Otis had spent his military career fighting against. "That's impossible." Marcus worked in logistics, but for legitimate companies. He had a college degree, references, a clean record. "He did work in logistics," Tommy agreed, "but not for the companies he told you about. Marcus was one of our most valuable assets, Mr. Matthews. He understood transportation networks, communication systems, and security protocols. He was instrumental in establishing our distribution network throughout the Pacific Northwest." The second photograph showed Marcus in what appeared to be a warehouse setting, surrounded by the kind of equipment and materials that had nothing to do with legal commerce. The third showed him with other men that Otis didn't recognize, all of them examining documents that looked disturbingly similar to the shipping manifests they'd found in the container. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you need to understand that the money in that shipping container wasn't random criminal proceeds. It was Marcus's payment for a job that went very badly wrong. $90 million that he was supposed to deliver to our associates in Seattle. Money that disappeared along with your son when he decided he wanted out of the organization." Otis felt the world shifting beneath him. Everything he thought he understood about his son's life being rewritten by revelations that were somehow both shocking and inevitable. Marcus had been in debt when he died. Debts that now made sense if he'd been involved with people who didn't accept bankruptcy as an excuse for non-payment. "The car accident wasn't an accident," Tommy said quietly. "Marcus had decided that he wanted to leave the organization and return to Montana. He wanted to use our money to buy his way out of his obligations and start a new life with his daughter. We couldn't allow that to happen." The flat statement hit Otis like a physical blow. His son hadn't died in a random traffic accident. He'd been murdered by people who'd considered him a liability rather than an asset. The grief and guilt that Otis had carried for 3 years suddenly transformed into something darker and more focused. "You killed him. We eliminated a security risk. Marcus knew too much about our operations to be allowed to simply walk away. But he was clever about it. He hid the money before we could recover it, left instructions that led to its eventual discovery by people who would understand its significance. Tommy placed a final photograph on the table, an image of the shipping container in its current location behind the Henderson place, but clearly taken weeks or months earlier when it had been positioned differently and still sealed. Marcus arranged for the container to be placed where his daughter would eventually find it. He knew that children explore abandoned places, and he knew that Scout would lead her to anything unusual in the area. This was his attempt to provide for Lila's future even after his death. The revelation recontextualized everything that had happened since the discovery. Marcus had orchestrated the entire sequence of events from beyond the grave, using his knowledge of criminal operations to hide money in a way that would eventually benefit his daughter, while making it difficult for his former employers to recover their assets. He never intended for you to be caught in the middle of this, Tommy continued, but he underestimated our determination to recover what belongs to us, and he overestimated the protection that distance and time would provide. Otis looked at the photographs scattered across the table, each one revealing aspects of Marcus's life that he'd never suspected. His son had been involved with dangerous people, making choices that had ultimately cost him his life. But he'd also been thinking about Lila, trying to provide for her future in the only way he knew how. What do you want from me? The same thing we've always wanted. The location of our money. Marcus was clever about hiding it, but he wasn't clever enough to hide it permanently. We know you found the container, and we know you've had time to examine its contents. The money belongs to us, and we're prepared to be reasonable about recovering it, and if I cooperate, then you and your granddaughter can continue your lives without further interference from our organization. We have no interest in causing unnecessary harm to people who aren't threats to our operations. And if I don't cooperate, Tommy's expression hardened, then we'll recover our property through less pleasant means, and we'll eliminate the security risks that non-cooperation would represent. The threat was clear, but the revelation about Marcus had changed the calculus entirely. This wasn't just about found money anymore. This was about a father's attempt to provide for his daughter, even at the cost of his own life. Marcus had hidden the money specifically for Lila's benefit, trusting that Otis would understand its significance and find a way to use it wisely. I need time to consider what you've told me. Time is the one thing we can't provide, Tommy replied. Our organization has invested significant resources in recovering these assets. Every day that passes increases the risk that law enforcement agencies will become involved in ways that create complications for everyone. Otis studied the photographs again, seeing his son's face in a completely new light. Marcus had made terrible choices that had cost him his life, but his final act had been one of love rather than selfishness. The shipping container wasn't random criminal proceeds, it was a father's attempt to secure his daughter's future. The money's already been moved, Otis said finally. Your people took the container 3 days ago. Tommy's surprise was genuine. That's impossible. We haven't recovered the container, then someone else took it. Someone else who knew about the money and had the resources to move a shipping container without being detected. The implications of this revelation were clearly disturbing to Tommy and his associates. If another party had intervened to claim the money, it meant that the situation was more complex than they'd realized. It also meant that their careful surveillance had missed something crucial. Who else knew about the container's location? Half the valley by now. Word spreads fast in small communities, especially when it involves the kind of money that could change people's lives. Tommy stood up abruptly, his professional composure cracking for the first time. Mr. Matthews, if you're lying to me, if you're trying to buy time or create confusion, I want you to understand that my patience has limits. I'm telling you the truth. The container disappeared between Friday night and Saturday morning. If your people didn't take it, then someone else beat you to it. The meeting ended with Tommy and his associates departing quickly, clearly needing to regroup and assess a situation that had become significantly more complicated. Otis remained on the porch for several minutes after they left, staring at the photographs that had rewritten his understanding of his son's life and death. Marcus had died trying to escape the criminal world he'd become involved with, but he'd also died trying to provide for Lila's future. The money in the shipping container represented both the fruits of criminal activity and a father's love for his daughter. Understanding that complexity didn't make the moral choices any easier, but it did make them more personal. Now Otis had to decide whether to honor his son's intentions by finding a way to use the money for Lila's benefit, or whether to continue trying to distance his family from the consequences of Marcus's choices. Either decision carried risks that extended far beyond the immediate threat posed by Tommy Vance and his organization. But one thing had become clear. This was no longer just about protecting Lila from random criminal violence. This was about protecting her from the consequences of her father's choices, while finding a way to honor his memory and his final act of love. After Tommy Vance departed, Otis sat alone on his porch until dawn, staring at the photographs that had shattered his understanding of his son's final years. The images told a story of choices and consequences that extended far beyond what he'd imagined. But they also raised questions that Tommy's revelations hadn't answered. If Marcus had hidden the container for Lila to find, why hadn't he left more explicit instructions? If he'd been planning to leave the criminal organization, why hadn't he reached out for help? And most importantly, if the money was meant to provide for Lila's future, how could Otis access it without putting her in the same danger that had ultimately killed her father? The answers came at sunrise, when Otis returned to the Henderson place and conducted a more thorough search of the area where the container had been positioned. Hidden beneath a loose piece of corrugated metal that had been part of the container's camouflage, he found a waterproof pouch containing documents that Tommy Vance's people had apparently overlooked. The most important item was a letter written in Marcus's familiar handwriting, addressed simply to Dad. The pages were filled with explanations, apologies, and instructions that revealed the full scope of his son's final plan. I know you probably think I threw my life away chasing easy money and excitement. You were right about some of that, but wrong about my reasons. I didn't leave Clearwater Valley because I thought it wasn't good enough. I left because I thought I wasn't good enough for it. After Mom died, I watched you try to hold everything together, and I knew I was just another burden you couldn't afford. The arguments we had weren't about the valley or about staying versus leaving. They were about me trying to prove that I could make something of myself somewhere else, something that would make you proud instead of disappointed. The logistics work was legitimate at first, but the money was never enough to pay down my college debts and still send anything home to help with Lila. When I was offered opportunities to handle more sensitive shipments, the pay was too good to refuse. I told myself it was temporary, just until I could get ahead financially. By the time I understood what I was really involved with, I was in too deep to get out easily. These people don't accept resignations, and they don't forgive mistakes. But when Lila was born, everything changed. I couldn't keep working for people who would destroy her future just to protect their profits. The money in the container is payment for a job I completed but never delivered. It's dirty money, I won't lie about that. But it's also the only inheritance I can leave for Lila. If something happens to me before I can get back to Montana, I've arranged for her to find it when she's old enough to explore the places where kids naturally wander. I know this puts you in an impossible position. Keeping the money makes you complicit in crimes you had nothing to do with. Reporting it to the authorities might put Lila in danger from people who don't distinguish between family members when it comes to eliminating security risks. But there's a third option. Dad, the documentation I've included with this letter contains evidence of the organization's activities throughout the region. Names, locations, financial records, everything law enforcement would need to dismantle their operations completely. If that information reaches the right people, It could end the threat to our family while ensuring justice for their victims. The choice is yours, and I'll understand whatever decision you make. But please know that everything I did, right or wrong, was motivated by love for you and Lila. I wanted to come home, Dad. I wanted to repair our relationship and be the kind of father to Lila that you were to me. I just ran out of time. I love you both more than I ever found the courage to say while I was alive. Otis read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. Marcus hadn't just hidden money for Lila's benefit. He'd created an opportunity to bring down the entire criminal organization that had ultimately killed him. The evidence in the pouch was comprehensive enough to support federal prosecutions that would eliminate the threat to their family permanently, but using that evidence would require revealing his knowledge of the container's contents and Marcus's involvement with the criminal organization. It would expose Lila to scrutiny and potential retaliation during the period before the prosecutions could be completed. The safe option was still to walk away from everything and hope that distance would provide protection. Marcus had understood the dilemma and left the choice to his father, trusting Otis to make the decision that would best protect Lila's interests. It was a final act of faith from a son who'd spent his adult life trying to prove his worth to a father who'd never doubted it. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted Otis's contemplation. Sheriff Bradley was driving toward the Henderson place, followed by 2 state police cars that hadn't been there minutes earlier. As the vehicles drew closer, Otis could see that Bradley's hands were secured to his steering wheel with zip ties, and that the men in the state police cars weren't wearing standard uniforms. The convoy stopped 50 yards from Otis's position, close enough for conversation, but far enough to provide tactical options if the situation deteriorated. One of the men in state police uniforms approached on foot, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. "Mr. Matthews, I'm Detective Morrison with the Montana State Police. We need to discuss some irregularities in Sheriff Bradley's handling of recent events in this area." Otis recognized the manufactured authority immediately. These weren't legitimate law enforcement officers. They were criminals using stolen or forged credentials to create the appearance of official sanction for whatever they planned to do. "What kind of irregularities?" "Sheriff Bradley has been interfering with a federal investigation by withholding evidence and providing unauthorized assistance to persons of interest. We're here to correct those oversights and ensure that proper procedures are followed going forward." Bradley's voice carried clearly across the distance between them. "Don't listen to them, Otis. They're not real cops. They took my car at gunpoint and forced me to drive here." The fake detective's expression hardened. "Sheriff Bradley is facing serious charges related to obstruction of justice. His credibility is obviously compromised by his personal relationships in this community." Otis found himself faced with the choice that Marcus's letter had anticipated. He could cooperate with these people, hoping that submission would protect both Bradley and his own family from immediate violence. Or he could act on the evidence that Marcus had provided, using it to expose the corruption that had allowed criminals to operate with impunity throughout the region. "What exactly do you want from me?" "The same thing everyone wants, Mr. Matthews. Information about the location of property that doesn't belong to you. Sheriff Bradley has been less than forthcoming about his knowledge of recent discoveries in this area, but we're hoping you'll be more cooperative." The fake detective gestured toward Bradley's patrol car, where another man in stolen uniform was positioning himself behind the vehicle with what appeared to be a sniper rifle. The message was clear. Cooperation was expected, and resistance would have immediate consequences for both of them. But Otis had spent the past week preparing for exactly this scenario. The evidence pouch was already in his jacket pocket, and the emergency communication device Ray had provided was within easy reach. More importantly, he'd established defensive positions throughout the area that would provide advantages if the situation turned violent. "The container you're looking for was moved 3 days ago," Otis said. "I don't know who took it or where it went, but it's not here anymore." That's the same story Tommy Vance heard from you last night. But we've had time to investigate further, and we believe you're not being entirely truthful about your level of involvement. The fake detective pulled out a tablet computer and showed Otis surveillance footage of his own property. The images clearly showed him conducting searches around his house, removing electronic devices, and establishing what appeared to be defensive preparations. People who are innocent don't typically behave like someone preparing for armed conflict. Mr. Matthews, your activities over the past week suggest that you know more about recent events than you've been willing to admit. Otis realized that his preparations had been more visible than he'd intended. The criminals had been conducting their own surveillance, documenting his activities and using them as evidence of guilt or knowledge that justified whatever actions they planned to take. I was being careful because strangers had been asking questions about my family. In my experience, when people start asking about children, it's time to take precautions. What kind of precautions? The question was a trap designed to elicit information about his defensive preparations and tactical capabilities. Otis recognized the interrogation technique and understood that honest answers would only provide intelligence that could be used against him, the kind that any grandfather would take when his granddaughter's safety is threatened. This conversation continued for several more minutes, with the fake detective applying increasing pressure while Otis provided minimal responses. But the real communication was taking place through eye contact and subtle signals between Otis and Sheriff Bradley, who was clearly looking for an opportunity to break free from his restraints. The situation reached its breaking point when a third vehicle arrived, Ray Castellanos, driving a truck that looked like it belonged to a local utility company but contained equipment and personnel that definitely didn't. The truck stopped in a position that provided cover for both Otis and Bradley, while creating tactical problems for the criminals who'd been controlling the encounter. "Gentlemen," Ray called from behind the truck's open door, "I'm Federal Agent Castellanos, and you're all under arrest for impersonating law enforcement officers and conspiracy to commit kidnapping." The response was immediate and violent. The fake detective drew his weapon, while the sniper behind Bradley's car shifted his aim toward Ray's position. But Otis had been expecting this moment and was already moving toward cover while activating the emergency beacon that would summon additional federal backup. The next few minutes would determine whether Marcus's evidence would reach legitimate authorities or whether the corruption that had enabled these criminals would continue to protect them from consequences. But for the first time in a week, Otis felt like he was fighting from a position of strength rather than desperation. The war for Clearwater Valley was about to begin, and this time the good guys had better intelligence, superior tactical positioning, and the moral clarity that came from protecting innocent lives rather than criminal profits. As gunfire erupted across the Henderson place, Otis found himself remembering skills he'd hoped never to use again. But if violence was the only language these people understood, then he was prepared to conduct a conversation they would never forget. The gunfight at the Henderson place ended as quickly as it had begun, with the fake law enforcement officers retreating rather than engaging in a prolonged battle against federal agents who clearly outmatched their tactical capabilities. But Otis knew that the retreat was strategic rather than decisive. They would regroup and return with better intelligence and superior numbers. Sheriff Bradley, freed from his restraints and armed with his service weapon, coordinated with Ray's team to establish a perimeter around the immediate area. But the scope of the criminal organization's resources became apparent when surveillance reports started coming in from around the valley. At least 12 vehicles moving into position, Ray reported, studying updates from his tactical team. They're establishing observation points and blocking potential escape routes. This isn't a simple recovery operation anymore. They're planning a siege. The realization that the battle would extend beyond the Henderson place forced immediate decisions about protecting civilian populations. Most of Clearwater Valley's residents were elderly or families with children. People who had no connection to the conflict, but who could become casualties if the violence spread throughout the community. "We need to evacuate non-combatants," Bradley said. "Get them out of the area before this turns into a war zone." But the evacuation proved more complicated than expected. Mrs. Chen had returned during the night, driving her old sedan with the kind of determined efficiency that suggested she'd been planning her involvement for days. She refused to leave her property and instead began preparing her house as a defensive position, using furniture and household items to create barricades that would provide cover for anyone who needed it. "I didn't survive the Korean War just to be run off my own land by a bunch of criminals," she announced when Bradley tried to convince her to seek safety elsewhere. "Besides, someone needs to coordinate communications and watch the roads. You boys will need intelligence support if you're going to fight smart instead of just fighting hard." Jake Morrison arrived shortly after dawn, driving a truck loaded with supplies that he began distributing to anyone who was staying to fight. "Figured you might need ammunition, medical supplies, and food that doesn't require cooking," he said. "Also brought my hunting rifles and enough spotting equipment to keep track of anyone moving through the valley." The community's response surprised everyone, including Otis. People who'd spent the past week wrestling with the moral implications of found money suddenly found themselves united by the common threat posed by outsiders who were willing to use violence against their neighbors. The criminal organization had underestimated the bond that held small communities together when external forces threatened their way of life. Pastor Williams arrived at mid-morning, driving his pickup truck with Margaret and Lila in the cab and Scout riding in the truck bed. "The girl was worried about her grandfather," he explained. "And frankly, so were we. She belongs with family during times like this." Otis felt torn between relief at seeing Lila and terror at having her in potential danger. But Scout's behavior immediately demonstrated why she'd been right to insist on returning. The dog had developed an uncanny ability to detect approaching threats, alerting to movements and sounds that human senses couldn't perceive. Within an hour of their arrival, Scout had identified 3 separate surveillance positions that Ray's team had missed. "That animal has better tactical awareness than most soldiers I've worked with," Ray observed as Scout guided them toward a concealed observation post. "Keep him close. He's going to be crucial if this turns into an extended engagement." The afternoon brought the first serious test of their defensive preparations. A team of 6 men approached Otis's property from the east, moving with professional coordination, but without adequate knowledge of local terrain. They'd planned their approach using satellite imagery rather than ground reconnaissance, and their route took them directly through an area where Scouts' early warning allowed defensive positions to be manned before the attack began. The brief firefight demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of their position. The criminal organization had superior numbers and professional military equipment, but they were operating in unfamiliar territory against people who'd spent decades learning every rock, tree, and creek bed in Clearwater Valley. Otis found himself drawing on skills he'd hoped never to use again, coordinating fields of fire and tactical movements with an efficiency that surprised everyone, including himself. But the most unsettling moment came when he realized that one of the attackers had gotten close enough to require hand-to-hand engagement. The combat knife had been with him since Vietnam, a weapon he'd carried through 2 tours and countless operations, but had sworn never to use again after mustering out of the military. It represented everything violent and destructive that he'd tried to leave behind when he'd chosen the peaceful life of Clearwater Valley. But when the intruder appeared in his kitchen, clearly intending to use Lila as leverage against the defenders, Otis didn't hesitate. The knife moved with muscle memory that transcended conscious thought, ending the threat with the kind of efficient violence that protected innocence by destroying those who would exploit it. Lila witnessed the encounter from the doorway where she'd been hiding with Scout. The look in her eyes afterward, not fear, but recognition that her grandfather was capable of things she'd never suspected marked another threshold in her understanding of adult complexities. "Are you okay, Grandpa?" she asked quietly, as if understanding that the question applied to more than just physical injuries. "I'm okay, honey. And you're safe. That's what matters." But Otis knew that something fundamental had changed between them. She'd seen him use lethal force to protect her, and while she might not understand all the implications, she would carry that knowledge for the rest of her life. The innocence that he'd been trying so desperately to preserve had become another casualty of the conflict that Marcus's choices had set in motion. The evening brought reports that the criminal organization was regrouping for a more serious assault. Intelligence suggested they were bringing in additional personnel and heavier weapons, preparing for a battle that would determine whether Clearwater Valley remained under the protection of legitimate authority or fell under the control of people who recognized no law except profit and violence. Ray's federal team had called for additional support, but bureaucratic complications meant that significant reinforcement wouldn't arrive for at least 12 hours. The defenders would have to hold their positions through the night using resources they had immediately available. "Tomorrow will determine everything," Ray said as they prepared final defensive positions. "If we can hold until backup arrives, we can end this permanently. If they overrun us, everyone in this valley becomes a target for elimination." Otis looked at his granddaughter, sleeping peacefully in Margaret Williams's arms while Scout maintained watch nearby. The battle had already cost more than he'd wanted to pay, but surrender would cost everything that mattered. The choice was no longer between right and wrong. It was between fighting for family and losing family to people who would never stop taking until they'd taken everything. As darkness fell over Clearwater Valley, Otis cleaned his combat knife and prepared for whatever the night would bring. The weapon represented violence that he'd hoped to never use again, but it also represented protection for the only family he had left. Sometimes love required terrible choices, and sometimes protecting innocence meant embracing the very violence you were trying to shield your children from witnessing. The final assault came just before dawn, when exhaustion had dulled the defenders' vigilance and darkness still provided cover for coordinated movement. Tommy Vance led the attack personally this time, bringing 20 men armed with military-grade weapons and night vision equipment that gave them significant tactical advantages. But the criminal organization had made a crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that rural resistance would collapse under professional pressure, that people who'd chosen quiet lives in an isolated valley wouldn't have the resolve to sustain a prolonged fight. They hadn't accounted for the fierce loyalty that bound communities together when everything they cared about was threatened. The battle began with explosions that shattered windows throughout the valley as the attackers used grenades to breach defensive positions. Mrs. Chen's house took a direct hit, but the elderly woman had anticipated the attack and relocated to a reinforced basement where she continued coordinating communications between scattered defenders. Not Jake Morrison's position near the main road came under intense fire, but he'd spent 40 years hunting in these hills and knew every natural concealment that could provide cover. His accurate rifle fire forced the attackers to take longer routes that exposed them to crossfire from other defensive positions. Otis found himself at the center of the conflict, protecting the church where Pastor Williams had established a makeshift aid station for wounded defenders. Lila and Margaret Williams had been moved to the basement, but Scout remained with Otis, the dog's exceptional hearing providing early warning of approaching threats. The turning point came when Tommy Vance himself appeared in the church parking lot, carrying a high-powered rifle and clearly intending to eliminate Otis personally. The two men faced each other across 50 yards of open ground, each understanding that this confrontation would determine the outcome of the entire battle. "This didn't have to happen, Matthews," Tommy called out. "All we wanted was our property back. Your son stole from us, and we were willing to let his family live with the consequences. But you had to make it complicated. Marcus died trying to get away from people like you, Otis replied. The least I can do is make sure his daughter doesn't grow up in a world where criminals operate with impunity. Noble sentiment. But nobility doesn't stop bullets, and it doesn't protect little girls from the consequences of their grandfather's poor decisions. Tommy raised his rifle, but Scout's warning bark alerted Otis to movement behind him. Another attacker had circled through the cemetery, positioning himself for a flanking shot that would have ended the confrontation before it began. Otis's response was instinctive and lethal, the combat knife finding its target with precision that surprised both men. The distraction gave Tommy the opening he needed, but his shot went wide as return fire from Ray's federal team forced him to seek cover. The battle devolved into a running firefight that moved through the valley's familiar landmarks, turning places of childhood memories into scenes of adult violence. It was during this chaos that Otis remembered the final piece of Marcus's legacy, a small key that had been tucked into his son's letter, almost overlooked among the more dramatic revelations about criminal organizations and hidden money. The key bore the logo of a bank in Billings and numbers that corresponded to a safety deposit box that Marcus had rented under an assumed name. The significance of the key became clear when Ray's tactical team established communication with federal investigators who'd been tracking the criminal organization for months. Marcus hadn't just gathered evidence of local operations, he'd documented the entire network, including financial records, communication intercepts, and operational plans that extended throughout the western United States. This is everything we've been looking for, Ray reported after reviewing the material that Marcus had secured in the safety deposit box. Names, dates, financial transactions, communication logs. This evidence will support prosecutions that will dismantle the entire organization from top to bottom, but the immediate threat still had to be resolved. Tommy Vance and his remaining men had taken defensive positions in the abandoned Henderson Place, using the familiar terrain to their advantage, while federal reinforcements moved into position to end the siege. The final confrontation was personal rather than tactical. Tommy emerged from the Henderson house carrying a white flag, but his surrender was contingent on negotiating terms that would allow him to escape prosecution in exchange for information about his organization's activities. "I can give you bigger fish. Matthews," he called out, "people in government positions, judges, law enforcement officials who've been taking our money for years. This organization extends far beyond what you've seen here." Otis faced the choice that would define his legacy: accept a deal that would allow his family's tormentor to escape justice, or insist on accountability regardless of the larger implications. The decision would determine not just Tommy's fate, but also what lessons Lila would learn about the cost of doing the right thing. "Justice isn't negotiable," Otis replied. "You killed my son, threatened my granddaughter, and terrorized my community. Whatever information you have can be extracted through proper legal channels." Tommy's response was to raise his weapon one final time, forcing a confrontation that ended with the kind of violence that Otis had hoped to avoid, but had been prepared to accept. The federal team's intervention ensured that the threat ended permanently, but also ensured that the questions about corruption and complicity would be answered through legitimate investigation rather than criminal negotiation. As the sun rose over Clearwater Valley, the immediate danger had passed, but the larger questions about legacy, justice, and the price of protecting family remained. Otis had kept his promise to safeguard Lila's future, but he'd done so by embracing the very violence that he'd spent decades trying to leave behind. The transformation from regretful grandfather to protective warrior was complete, but it had come at the cost of innocence, both his own and Lila's. They would move forward together, bound by love and scarred by violence, carrying the knowledge that sometimes protecting the people you love requires. Terrible sacrifices that can never be undone. Marcus's evidence would indeed bring down the criminal organization that had destroyed so many lives, ensuring that his death had meaning beyond the tragedy of a father who'd run out of time to repair his mistakes. But his true legacy lived in the granddaughter who'd witnessed her grandfather fight for her future, learning lessons about courage, sacrifice, and the complex moral calculations that define adult responsibilities. The battle for Clearwater Valley was over, but the war for Lila's future, for all their futures, would continue through the choices they made in the aftermath of violence, when the real work of healing and rebuilding began. 6 months after the battle that had transformed Clearwater Valley from a forgotten rural community into a federal crime scene, life had begun to settle into patterns that resembled normalcy. Though nothing would ever be quite the same as it had been before a 9-year-old girl and her dog had discovered a shipping container full of secrets, the legal proceedings had unfolded with the methodical precision that federal prosecutors brought to cases involving organized crime and interstate criminal enterprises. Marcus's evidence, combined with intelligence gathered during the siege, had provided the foundation for indictments that reached into 12 states and included more than 60 defendants. The corruption that had protected the criminal organization extended further than anyone had anticipated, encompassing judges, law enforcement officials, and politicians who'd accepted money in exchange for looking the other way. Tommy Vance and his surviving associates were facing life sentences without the possibility of parole. Their attempts to negotiate reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation having been rejected by prosecutors who determined that their crimes warranted the full measure of justice. The money from the shipping container had been declared proceeds of criminal activity and forfeited to the federal government, but not before a portion had been allocated to a victim compensation fund that would provide restitution to families affected by the organization's activities. For Otis, the legal resolution had brought a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. Justice had been served, but at a cost that would echo through the rest of his life. He'd been forced to testify about his son's involvement with the criminal organization, revealing details about Marcus's final years that painted a complex portrait of a young man who'd made terrible choices while trying to provide for his family. The hardest part had been explaining to Lila why her father had been involved with dangerous people and why he'd hidden money instead of simply asking his family for help. She'd listened with the solemn attention that children bring to conversations about adult failures, absorbing information that no 9-year-old should have to process. "Daddy made mistakes," she'd said after one particularly difficult conversation. "But he was trying to take care of me." "That's right, honey. He loved you enough to die trying to give you a better future. And you love me enough to fight to protect it." The simple statement had cut through all the moral complexity and legal complications to identify the essential truth. Love had motivated every important decision, from Marcus's initial involvement with criminals to his final attempt to provide for his daughter. From Otis's choice to investigate the shipping container to his willingness to risk everything to protect his granddaughter, the physical reconstruction of Clearwater Valley had been completed more quickly than the emotional healing. Federal funds had been allocated to repair the damage from the battle, and construction crews had replaced broken windows, repaired damaged buildings, and restored the infrastructure that had been disrupted during the siege. The community looked much as it had before, but the people who lived there carried themselves differently, with the quiet confidence of individuals who discovered they were capable of more courage than they'd ever imagined. Mrs. Chen had become something of a local celebrity, her role in coordinating communications during the battle having earned recognition from federal law, enforcement agencies, and media attention that she accepted, with the gracious modesty of someone who'd simply done what the situation required. She'd used her newfound prominence to advocate for better security measures in rural communities, arguing that isolation shouldn't mean vulnerability to criminal exploitation. Jake Morrison had expanded his store to include a small cafe that served as an unofficial community center, a place where residents could gather to share information, coordinate mutual assistance, and maintain the social connections that had proven so crucial during the crisis. The store had also become an unofficial museum of sorts, displaying photographs and memorabilia from the battle that had defined their community's modern identity. Sheriff Bradley had been vindicated by the investigation that followed the siege, his cooperation with federal authorities having been recognized as crucial to the successful prosecution of the criminal organization. He'd been promoted to regional coordinator for rural crime prevention, a position that allowed him to share the lessons learned in Clearwater Valley with other communities facing similar threats. Pastor Williams had conducted memorial services for the 3 defenders who'd been killed during the battle, ceremonies that celebrated their sacrifice while acknowledging the tragic circumstances that had made violence necessary. The small church had become a focal point for community healing, offering counseling services and support groups for residents struggling with the aftermath of trauma. But for Otis, the most significant change had been in his relationship with Lila. The shared experience of danger and loss had created a bond between them that transcended typical grandparent-grandchild relationships. She'd seen him as both protector and warrior, understanding that love sometimes required terrible choices and that adults carried burdens that children couldn't fully comprehend. She'd grown up faster than he'd wanted, but she'd also grown stronger. The innocence that he'd been so desperate to preserve had been replaced by wisdom that would serve her well in a world that wasn't always kind to the vulnerable. She understood that money could corrupt people, that adults sometimes made mistakes that affected their families for generations, and that standing up for what was right often came at significant personal cost. On a crisp autumn morning, almost exactly a year after the initial discovery of the shipping container, Otis and Lila walked Scout through the familiar fields that surrounded their home. The dog wore a new collar, simple black leather that had replaced the one that had been damaged during the battle. The new collar was clean and unmarked, symbolizing the fresh start that all of them were trying to make in the aftermath of violence and loss. Scout ranged ahead of them with the enthusiasm that had always characterized his explorations, but his movements were more purposeful now, as if he'd learned to distinguish between adventure and danger. The dog had emerged from the conflict as something of a hero, his warnings having saved multiple lives during the siege. But like his human companions, he carried invisible scars from experiences that had changed his understanding of the world. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we'd never found that container?" Lila asked as they paused at the spot where the shipping container had once been hidden. "Sometimes," Otis admitted. "But then I remember that your father wanted us to find it. He knew it would cause problems, but he also knew it would give us a chance to make things right. Do you think he would be proud of what we did?" Otis considered the question carefully, thinking about the son who died, trying to escape the consequences of his choices, and the granddaughter who'd witnessed the price of fighting for justice. "I think he'd be proud that you grew up to be someone who asks the right questions, even when the answers are complicated. And I think he'd be grateful that you're safe and surrounded by people who love you." They continued their walk in comfortable silence, 2 people who'd survived more than most families ever face, bound together by love that had been tested by violence and refined by shared trauma. The valley spread out around them, peaceful in the morning light, showing no visible signs of the battle that had determined its future. In the distance, Mrs. Chen could be seen tending her garden. Jake Morrison was opening his store for another day of serving the community, and Pastor Williams was preparing for Sunday services that would celebrate both faith and the strength that came from facing darkness together. Clearwater Valley would never again be the forgotten rural community it had once been, but it had become something more valuable, a place where people had discovered what they were capable of when everything they cared about was threatened. It was a community that understood the price of safety and the cost of justice, but also the value of standing together when individual strength wasn't enough. For Otis Matthews, the transformation from regretful grandfather to reluctant warrior was complete. He'd protected his family, honored his son's memory, and helped ensure that justice prevailed over criminal corruption. The cost had been higher than he'd wanted to pay. But the alternative, allowing his granddaughter to grow up in a world where criminals operated with impunity, had been unacceptable. As they walked back toward home, Scout running ahead to investigate interesting scents while Lila chatted about school projects and weekend plans, Otis realized that they'd found their way to something that resembled peace. It wasn't the innocent peace he'd known before the discovery of $90 million. But it was the hard-won peace that came from surviving trials that revealed what truly mattered. Sometimes the most important discoveries weren't about what you found, but about what you were willing to fight to protect. In the end, that was the real treasure that had been hidden in Clearwater Valley all along. Not criminal proceeds or ill-gotten gains, but the love between family members who'd learned that protecting each other was worth any price.